While I got pulled over by a cop, he said, "Wouldn't you rather drive straight to the hospital? Is this some sort of joke?" I asked when the officer said those strange words instead of asking for license and registration. The cop handed back my license that I'd already pulled out. His face had changed from stern authority to something softer and sadder. "I just got radioed in about what happened. I'm terribly sorry for your loss, sir." Before I could ask, "What loss?" he was already jogging back to his patrol car. He turned on his lights again, but this time pulled in front of me and blocked traffic so I could merge left immediately. Other cars moved aside as he created a clear path for me to speed ahead. I sat there frozen for a moment before pressing the gas. My hands were trembling on the steering wheel as I tried to process what just happened. The cop knew something I didn't. Something bad enough that he'd let me go without even a warning about my speed. I fumbled for my phone while keeping one eye on the road. I just landed at LAX an hour ago after a 3-day business trip to Seattle. My wife Carly hadn't answered when I called from baggage claim, but that wasn't unusual. She often had her phone on silent while teaching her kindergarten class. I called her again, straight to voicemail. I tried our home phone. Nothing. My chest started feeling tight as I scrolled to her sister's number. Voicemail. Her mom. Voicemail. My mom. No answer. The highway stretched ahead of me, but I wasn't really seeing it anymore. My mind was racing through possibilities. Car accident. House fire. Something at her school. Each scenario worse than the last. The cop had said loss. That word kept echoing in my head. Finally, I called my brother Harvey. It rang 4 times before his wife Paulina answered. She was crying so hard I could barely understand her. How can she do this? I don't understand why she would do this. Paulina kept repeating between sobs. What happened? Where's Carly? Is she okay? I was practically shouting into the phone. Paulina just cried harder. I heard Harvey's voice in the background telling her to give him the phone. There was shuffling and muffled voices before the line went dead. I called back 3 times, but no one answered. I was doing 90 now, weaving between cars. Other drivers honked, but I didn't care. Something had happened to my wife, and no one would tell me what. The exit was coming up, and I took it without signaling. I knew that's where they'd take her. It was the closest trauma center to her school. The hospital parking lot was a maze, but I abandoned my car in the first spot I saw. Legal or not, I didn't care. I ran through the sliding doors into the emergency room lobby. The smell of disinfectant and fear hit me immediately. I'm looking for my wife. Carly Munoz. She was brought here. I didn't even know when or why. The nurse at the desk typed something into her computer. When she looked back up at me, her eyes were watery. She knew who I was before I'd even given my name. The security guard will escort you. Her voice was barely a whisper. A large man in a blue uniform appeared and gestured for me to follow. We walked through endless hallways past rooms full of beeping machines and worried families. My legs felt like they might give out, but I kept moving. The guard didn't say a word, just kept glancing at me with that same sad look everyone seemed to have. We took an elevator to the 3rd floor. Pediatric ICU, the sign said. Why were we in pediatrics if Carly was hurt? My brain couldn't make sense of it. The guard led me down another hallway where I could hear crying. Multiple people sobbing behind a closed door. I recognized voices as we got closer. Harvey, Paulina, Carly's parents, my mom. All of them were here, and no one had answered their phones because they were already at the hospital. The guard opened the door, and the crying stopped for a moment, as everyone turned to look at me. The room was full of family members I'd just been trying to call. Their faces were red and swollen from tears. Harvey stood up and walked toward me, but I pushed past him. I needed to see Carly, needed to know she was okay, even though everyone's presence here told me she wasn't. As I turned the corner into the room proper, my knees buckled. There were 3 beds, 3 bodies covered in white sheets, 2 adult-sized forms, and 1 tiny one that couldn't have been more than 3 feet long. A child. My hand was already reaching for the sheet before Harvey grabbed my wrist, but I pulled free and lifted the white fabric. Carly's face was there, pale and still, looking like she was sleeping except for the blue tint around her lips. Next to her bed was another one with a bigger man I recognized as Carlos, the janitor who always waved at me when I picked Carly up from the school. The smallest form made my stomach turn inside out because it was a kid, maybe 5 years old, with dark hair and a tiny hand poking out from under the sheet. My legs gave out completely, and Harvey caught me before I hit the floor, his arms holding me up while my whole body shook. A woman in a gray suit appeared beside me, her hospital badge saying Olivia Wheeler, and she guided me to a plastic chair while I gasped for air that wouldn't come. She was saying something in a calm voice about needing to discuss what happened, but all I could hear was this roaring sound in my ears like being underwater. The door opened again, and a man in a dark jacket walked in, showing his badge to Harvey before pulling up another chair near me. He waited while I tried to stop shaking, his notebook already out, and when I could finally focus on his face, he introduced himself as Detective Richard Hoffman from the police department. He explained they were still investigating, but the preliminary findings suggested carbon monoxide poisoning in Carly's classroom, his voice steady and professional while my brain tried to process those words. Carbon monoxide in a classroom didn't make any sense, and I kept shaking my head while he continued talking. He told me Carly had stayed late yesterday to prepare for today's lessons. Carlos was cleaning her room like he did every Thursday. And the small boy was Tiago Duran, whose parents had arranged for him to wait there after school until they got off work. All three were found unconscious when another teacher came looking for supplies around 6:30, and by then, it was already too late. The detective flipped through his notes and explained that the heating system in that wing of the school had been malfunctioning for weeks with multiple work orders submitted but never completed. The old boiler had been leaking gas into the ventilation system, and somehow it all built up in that specific room because of how the air ducts were configured. Paulina's words from the phone suddenly clicked in my head, and I realized she'd thought Carly had done something intentional, maybe thought it was murder-suicide, but this was an accident, a horrible, preventable accident that took 3 innocent lives. The door burst open and a couple rushed in, the woman already crying before she even saw the beds. Xavier and Danielle Matlock had been called from their jobs, and when Danielle saw her son's tiny body under that sheet, the sound she made was something I'll never forget. Pure animal grief that filled the entire room and made everyone else start crying harder. Xavier held her while she collapsed, both of them on their knees beside Tiago's bed, and I watched them pull back the sheet to see their baby's face one more time. We all ended up in the family waiting room, 2 sets of parents and 1 husband trying to understand how a normal Thursday afternoon turned into this nightmare. Xavier kept asking why the carbon monoxide detectors didn't work, his voice breaking with each word, and the detective had to explain that the detectors in that wing hadn't been checked in over a year. The principal arrived 20 minutes later, looking completely shattered, her makeup running down her face as she tried to explain that budget cuts had delayed the heating system repairs. She kept apologizing over and over, but her words felt empty against the weight of 3 bodies in the next room, especially when she admitted the district had the money, but allocated it to new computers instead. Harvey pulled me aside while the principal was talking to the Matlocks and showed me his phone screen with a text from Carly yesterday afternoon. She'd mentioned feeling dizzy and having a headache, but thought she was just tired from parent conferences all week, even made a joke about needing more coffee. If only she'd known the real danger, if only any of them had recognized the symptoms of carbon monoxide poisoning. But who thinks about that in a kindergarten classroom? The detective was taking statements from everyone, while Olivia Wheeler handed out paperwork about victim services and grief counseling that none of us could even look at yet. My phone kept buzzing with calls from people who'd heard something on the news, but I couldn't answer any of them, because what would I even say? The Matlocks were talking to the detective about their morning routine, how Tiago had been excited about show and tell, how he'd packed his favorite toy dinosaur in his backpack that was probably still in that classroom. Rosa arrived with her teenage daughter, both of them in complete shock when they saw Carlos under the sheet, and Rosa explained he always worked late on Thursdays because he took pride in making sure the kindergarten rooms were spotless for the little ones. The door opened, and a woman in a white coat walked in carrying a metal clipboard, and I could see her name tag said, Medical Examiner. Even though my vision was getting blurry from tears, I hadn't realized we're falling. She looked at all of us gathered around the 3 beds and cleared her throat before saying she needed to process the scene, and we'd have to step out for about an hour while she worked. Everyone started moving toward the door, but my feet wouldn't work right, and I found myself just standing there staring at the sheet covering Carly's face until Harvey grabbed my arm and pulled me into the hallway. The fluorescent lights were too bright and made everything look wrong, and I leaned against the wall trying to understand that my wife was really gone, but my brain kept rejecting it like a computer error message that wouldn't go away. My mom had been sitting in the corner this whole time, not saying anything, but now she walked over and put her hand on my shoulder, and I could see her eyes were red and puffy from crying. She told me she'd been trying to call me since 9 this morning when the hospital first contacted her, but she didn't want to leave this kind of news in a voicemail, so she just kept calling and calling, hoping I'd pick up. Her voice broke when she said she was so sorry, and then she wrapped her arms around me and we both started shaking with these huge sobs that felt like they were being ripped out of my chest. The detective came back down the hallway holding his notebook and asked if he could talk to me for a few minutes about Carly's work schedule and whether she'd mentioned feeling sick recently. I wiped my face with my sleeve and tried to focus on his questions while he wrote everything down in his little pad. I explained how I'd been in Seattle for 3 days on a business trip, and our last conversation Wednesday night was just normal stuff about what we'd have for dinner when I got back on Thursday, and she'd sounded fine and happy and excited to see me. He nodded and made notes about the timeline and asked if she ever complained about her classroom being too hot or cold or having any weird smells, but I couldn't remember anything like that. The elevator doors opened, and a woman walked out with a teenage girl who looked about 15, and they both had tears streaming down their faces, and I recognized them from the school events as Carlos's family. Rosa saw us all in the hallway and started crying harder when she spotted the closed door to the room where the bodies were, and she grabbed the detective's arm, asking where Carlos was and what happened to him. The detective explained about the carbon monoxide, and Rosa's knees buckled, but her daughter caught her and helped her to a chair while she kept saying Carlos always stayed late on Thursdays because he took so much pride in making those kindergarten rooms perfect for the kids. She said he'd been doing that same routine for 8 years, and Thursday was his special day to deep clean everything and make it shine for Friday morning. The principal came over and started talking to the detective, and I heard her mention that several other teachers in that wing had been complaining about headaches for the past 2 weeks. but everyone just thought it was the stress from parent conferences and report cards coming up. She pulled out her phone and showed him emails from 3 different teachers, all mentioning feeling dizzy or having headaches when they stayed late in their rooms, but nobody had connected it to anything dangerous. The detective wrote down all their names and said they'd need to be examined immediately, and the principal started making calls to track them down, while we all stood there realizing how many warning signs had been missed. A man in black clothes with a white collar came walking down the hallway and introduced himself as the hospital chaplain and asked if we wanted him to pray with us, even though I hadn't been to church since I was a kid. Xavier looked at Danielle and she nodded, and then Rosa nodded too. And somehow we all ended up standing in a circle in that bright hallway holding hands, while this stranger said words about comfort and peace. I felt Xavier's hand shaking in mine and heard Danielle crying softly, and even though I don't believe in any of that stuff, there was something about all of us standing together that made it hurt a little less for just those few seconds. Olivia came back, carrying a stack of papers and folders, and started handing them out to each family, explaining they were resources for victim services and grief counseling, and there would be support groups we could attend. She said there would be an investigation, and lawyers would probably get involved, but right now we just needed to focus on getting through the next few hours and days and not worry about the legal stuff yet. Her phone started buzzing, and she looked at it, and her face changed, and she told the principal that the news had broken, and parents were starting to call the school asking if their kids were safe. The principal's phone immediately started ringing, and she answered it trying to calm down what sounded like a hysterical parent, while she explained the building was evacuated and fully inspected by the fire department. She hung up and it rang again immediately, and she said she needed to go back to the school to help manage the situation, but she'd be back later, and she hurried toward the elevator still fielding calls. I suddenly remembered Carly's sister lived in Phoenix and she didn't know yet, and she deserved to hear this from me, not from some news report, so I pulled out my phone even though my hands were shaking, so bad I could barely unlock it. I found her number and hit call, and when she answered all cheerful asking how my trip went, I had to stop for a second, because I knew I was about to destroy her entire world with what I had to say next. I told her there was an accident at Carly's school, and she didn't make it, and the silence on the other end went on. So long I thought the call had dropped until I heard her start screaming. The detective walked back over after talking to the principal and mentioned something that made my stomach turn even more than it already was, about how the district had received a safety grant last year, specifically for updating old heating systems in the schools. He said the money had been redirected to buy new computers for the computer lab instead, and that decision was going to be a major part of the investigation into criminal negligence charges against the administrators who made that choice. Xavier's fist connected with the wall so hard that the sound echoed down the hallway, and everyone in the room jumped. His knuckles split open immediately, and blood started running down his hand as he screamed something about budgets and bureaucrats, and how they killed his son for a few $1,000s. 2 security guards started moving toward him, but Danielle waved them off and grabbed her husband's shoulders and pulled him against her chest. He collapsed into her arms, and his whole body shook with sobs that sounded like they were being ripped out of him. The detective stepped back and gave them space, while a nurse rushed over with gauze for Xavier's bleeding hand. He kept saying Tiago's name over and over, while Danielle held him and rocked him like she probably used to rock their son. The medical examiner came back into the room and pulled Olivia aside, and I heard him say something about the bodies needing to be held for full autopsies. Standard procedure in cases like this, he said, but the words hit me like a punch to the gut. The thought of Carly in some cold morgue drawer instead of coming home with me made my stomach turn, and I had to sit down before I fell down. Harvey's phone started buzzing, and he looked at it, and his face went even paler than it already was. He turned the screen toward me, and there it was in black and white on the local news website with the headline, 3 dead in the school gas leak. Seeing those words on a screen made everything real in a way that even seeing the bodies hadn't done. It wasn't just our private tragedy anymore, but something the whole city would be reading about over their morning coffee. The principal's phone rang, and she answered it, and I could hear a man's voice on the other end, saying he was the superintendent driving back from a conference in Sacramento. She put him on speaker, and his voice filled the room as he promised full cooperation with any investigation and said the district would provide whatever support the families needed. His words sounded practiced and empty, like he was reading from a script his lawyers had given him. Rosa had been sitting quietly in the corner, but she suddenly started talking about how Carlos had been planning to retire next year after 15 years of cleaning that school. She said they'd been saving up for a trip to visit his family in Mexico that he hadn't seen in 5 years. Her voice broke when she said he'd been so excited about showing their grandkids the village where he grew up. Dreams that died with him in that classroom while he was just doing his job like he did every Thursday night. My mind went to Carly's classroom, and I suddenly remembered her lesson plans were probably still sitting on her desk. The activities she'd spent hours planning that she'd never get to teach. Her handwriting on the board with tomorrow's date that would never come for her. Her coffee mug that was probably still half full of the vanilla latte she always got from the place down the street. Something broke inside me thinking about all those little pieces of her life just sitting there waiting for someone who would never come back. The detective cleared his throat and asked if we wanted to pursue criminal charges against the district for negligence. The words hung in the air, and nobody said anything for a long time. How could I even think about lawyers and lawsuits when I couldn't even accept that my wife was really gone? Xavier looked up from Danielle's shoulder and said yes immediately, but his voice was raw and broken. The detective nodded and made a note in his notebook. The elevator doors opened and an older woman stepped out, and I could tell right away she was related to Tiago because she had the same dark eyes, and the way she moved reminded me of him. Danielle saw her too, and her face crumpled as she realized she'd have to explain to her mother how her grandson had died. The older woman looked confused at first, but then she saw Danielle's face and started shaking her head like she could stop whatever was coming if she just refused hard enough. Danielle walked over to her and started talking in Spanish, and the woman's legs gave out. She kept saying mi niño over and over, and her voice was so destroyed by grief that it didn't even sound human anymore. Xavier and Danielle held her between them and guided her to a chair while she wailed in a way that made everyone in the room start crying again. A different nurse came in pushing a cart with sandwiches and bottles of water and cups of coffee that nobody wanted. She set everything on a table and left quickly like she couldn't get out of there fast enough. The food just sat there, untouched, while we all tried to figure out what happened next. How do you plan a funeral when you were supposed to be planning what to do this weekend? How do you pick out a casket when you should be picking out what movie to watch tonight? The elevator opened again, and a group of people stepped out, and I recognized some of them as teachers from Carly's school. They were all crying and hugging each other, and one of them came over to me and said Carly was the best teacher she'd ever worked with. Another one told Rosa that Carlos always had a smile for everyone and made sure their classrooms were perfect every morning. They shared stories about little Tiago and how he loved to help Carly pass out supplies and how he'd learned to write his whole name just last week. Each memory felt like both a comfort and a fresh wound because they were all in past tense now. A man in a fire department uniform walked into the waiting area carrying a folder and asked to speak with the families. He pulled out papers and started explaining that their team had tested the air quality in that classroom and found carbon monoxide levels that would have killed anyone within an hour. The readings were off the charts, way higher than what any detector should have missed. He showed us graphs and numbers that I couldn't really understand, but the bottom line was clear. Carly and Carlos and little Tiago had probably started feeling tired first, then gotten drowsy, then passed out without even knowing what was happening. The firefighter said it would have been like falling asleep. No pain, no panic, just drifting away. I didn't know if that was supposed to make us feel better, but it didn't. My mind kept going back to how Carly always stayed after school to get everything ready for the next day. She'd spend hours making sure every lesson was perfect, cutting out shapes for art projects, setting up science experiments, writing each kid's name on their work in her neat handwriting. She cared so much about those kids that she'd skip lunch to help struggling students, come in on weekends to decorate the classroom for holidays, spend her own money on supplies the school wouldn't provide. That dedication, that love for teaching, is what had her in that room when the gas was building up. If she'd just gone home on time like other teachers, if she hadn't cared so much, she'd still be alive. Xavier was holding Tiago's backpack, and he started talking about how his son would wake up every morning asking if it was a school day. When Xavier said yes, Tiago would jump out of bed and get dressed without being asked, so excited to see Miss Bamunos and his friends. He'd practice writing his letters at home to show her, draw pictures for her that she'd hang on the classroom wall. The one place where Tiago felt safe and happy, where he was learning and growing, turned into the place where he died waiting for his parents to pick him up. Xavier's voice cracked when he said Tiago had been so proud to be picked as classroom helper this week. The principal had been standing in the corner, but now she stepped forward with her own folder. Her hands were shaking as she pulled out emails and letters from the heating company that serviced the school. There were 3 warnings over the past 2 months about problems with the system in that wing. Each one recommended immediate repairs, each one marked urgent, and each one had been filed away because there wasn't money in the budget. She showed us the work orders that never got approved, the estimates that were deemed too expensive, the meetings where they decided to wait until summer break to deal with it. Every piece of paper was another chance to prevent this that got ignored. My phone had been vibrating nonstop in my pocket, and when I finally looked, there were dozens of messages. Friends from college, co-workers, neighbors. Everyone had heard the news somehow. They all said they were sorry, asked if I needed anything, offered to help however they could, but I couldn't answer any of them because what words could possibly explain this? How do you respond to sympathy texts when you can't even process that your wife is really gone? The detective who'd been taking notes looked at his watch and suggested maybe we should think about heading home since visiting hours were ending soon. He said there was nothing more we could do here tonight, that the bodies would need to stay for the full investigation. But leaving felt wrong, like I was abandoning Carly, like walking out meant accepting she was really dead. I knew she wasn't coming home, but somehow being in the same building as her body made it feel less final. Harvey put his hand on my shoulder and offered to drive me home since my car was probably getting towed from wherever I'd left it. But the thought of walking into our house made me feel sick. Everything there would smell like her shampoo, her coffee, her perfume. Her clothes would be in the closet, her toothbrush by the sink, her pillow on her side of the bed. The house we'd bought together, painted together, planned to raise kids in together, would just be a museum of our life that was over. I shook my head and told him I couldn't go there yet. Xavier heard us talking and came over with Danielle. They said they understood what I was feeling, that we were connected now by this horrible thing. They asked if I wanted to sit with them for a while, to talk about the people we'd lost. So we found a quiet corner and started sharing stories. I told them about Carly's first day teaching, how nervous she'd been that the kids wouldn't like her. Xavier talked about Tiago learning to ride his bike last month. Danielle remembered Carlos always singing while he mopped. Rosa joined us and mentioned something that made everyone go quiet. She said Carlos had told her last week that there was a weird smell in that part of the building. He'd reported it to maintenance, but they said it was probably just old pipes or something in the walls. Another warning sign that got explained away. Another chance to catch this before 3 people died. The medical examiner came back into the room with a clipboard and confirmed what the firefighter had already told us. All 3 victims showed clear signs of carbon monoxide poisoning. They would have felt sleepy within 20 minutes, unconscious within 30, and brain death would have followed soon after. The levels in their blood were so high that even if someone had found them sooner, the damage was probably already done. Olivia came back into the room holding a thick folder and a clipboard, pulling a chair up next to me, while everyone else was still trying to process what the medical examiner had said. She opened the folder and started showing me forms for death certificates, explaining how I'd need multiple copies for the bank, for insurance, for closing accounts, for everything that comes after someone dies. Her pen moved across the pages marking where I'd need to sign, where I'd need to fill in information, where I'd need to attach documents I didn't even know existed. My hand was shaking, so bad I could barely hold the pen she gave me. The insurance forms asked for cause of death, and I watched her write carbon monoxide poisoning in neat letters that made it real in a way nothing else had. She explained about funeral homes, about how they'd transport the body, about choosing between burial and cremation, about picking out caskets or urns, about death being this whole business I'd never thought about before. Xavier was across the room on his phone and suddenly jumped up, pointing at the window where we could see news vans pulling into the parking lot below. The principal got a text at the same time, warning us that reporters were gathering at the main entrance, that we should use the service elevators if we needed to leave. I felt this rage building in my chest at the thought of cameras in our faces, of our grief becoming someone else's news story, of having to dodge reporters while trying to process that my wife was dead. Harvey grabbed my arm when I started toward the window, pulling me back before I could do something stupid like go down there and start swinging at anyone holding a microphone. The elevator dinged, and I heard voices I recognized, turning to see Carly's parents rushing down the hallway, her mom already crying before she even reached the room. The moment she saw me, she just collapsed, her legs giving out completely, and her dad and I both grabbed her before she hit the floor. We held each other, the 3 of us who loved Carly most in the world, her mom sobbing so hard she couldn't breathe, her dad's tears soaking through my shirt, all of us trying to hold each other up when we could barely stand ourselves. The principal's phone kept buzzing, and she stepped into the hallway to take a call from the superintendent, coming back to tell us that all schools in the district would be closed tomorrow for emergency inspections. She showed us her phone where parents were already flooding the district Facebook page demanding answers, wanting to know how this could happen, how their kids could be safe in buildings that were supposed to protect them. I looked at the clock and realized it was Thursday night, that tomorrow was supposed to be our pizza night, our weekly tradition where Carly would pick up Hawaiian pizza, even though I always complained about pineapple not belonging on pizza. Such a stupid little argument we'd have every week, her laughing at my protests while eating her pineapple pieces first just to annoy me, something so small and normal that I'd never get to do again. The detective pulled me aside and said we needed to think about getting lawyers, that the district would already be assembling legal teams to protect themselves from liability. He handed me a business card for an attorney who specialized in wrongful death cases. The words, wrongful death, making me want to throw up, because this wasn't just death. It was death that shouldn't have happened. Xavier came over holding his phone, tears streaming down his face as he showed me a video from Tiago's birthday party last month. The little boy was laughing so hard as he tried to blow out his 5 candles, getting help from other kids, his whole life ahead of him in that moment. And now he was under a sheet in the next room because adults didn't fix a heating system. Harvey had stepped into the hallway, and I could hear him on the phone with funeral homes, taking charge because he knew I couldn't handle it. My little brother, who I'd always protected, now having to be the strong one. He came back with a notepad full of times and prices and options, trying to explain about coordinating 3 funerals, about whether we wanted them together or separate, about choices I couldn't even comprehend making. The day shift nurse, who'd been with us all day, came over in her street clothes, her shift over, and she squeezed my hand while saying she was sorry, adding her condolences to the dozens of others who'd said the same empty words. Rosa stood up, suddenly, and said she needed to go home, that she had 3 other kids who didn't know yet that their dad wasn't coming home from his janitor job. She asked if anyone could drive her because she didn't trust herself behind the wheel, and Paulina immediately offered, the 2 women holding each other as they walked toward the elevator. The thought of those kids losing their dad, of Carlos never coming home from the job he'd done for 15 years, of him dying while making sure kindergartners had clean classrooms, it was too much to process. The room felt smaller with each passing hour, the walls closing in as more people arrived, and left, as plans got made for things that shouldn't need planning, as we all tried to figure out what came next when what came next was 3 funerals for people who should still be alive. The principal's phone buzzed again, and she stepped away to answer it, coming back with her face even paler than before. She told us the EPA would be sending a team tomorrow to test the entire school for gas leaks and other hazards, something that should have happened months ago when teachers first complained about headaches. I pulled out my phone to check the time and saw 14 missed calls from work, so I stepped into the hallway to listen to my voicemail. My boss's voice was shaky as he said to take all the time I needed, that the whole office had heard what happened, and they were covering my projects. Time, as if any amount of it would help, as if there was some magic number of days that would make losing Carly bearable. Xavier walked over to me, and we exchanged phone numbers without saying much, both of us knowing we'd be connected forever by this day. We'd go to each other's funerals and check on each other for years, sharing a kind of grief that no one else could really understand. Back in the room, Carly's dad finally spoke up after hours of silence, his voice cracking as he talked about how proud he was when she became a teacher. He said she could have made more money doing other things, but she loved working with kids, loved shaping their minds and watching them learn new things every day. The detective pulled out his business card and handed one to me and one to Xavier, promising he'd be in touch as the investigation continued. He said they'd find out exactly who was responsible for ignoring the maintenance requests and letting the heating system get so dangerous. The clock on the wall showed it was almost midnight, and Olivia suggested we should probably leave soon since there wasn't anything else we could do here tonight. Tomorrow we'd have to start planning funerals, but tonight we just needed to get through the first hours without them. Harvey put his hand on my shoulder and said I was coming home with him, that Paulina had already made up the guest room and I shouldn't be alone. I nodded because I couldn't imagine going back to our empty house, seeing Carly's coffee mug on the counter or her shoes by the door. The Matlocks were getting ready to leave too. Danielle barely able to walk as Xavier held her up, both of them destroyed by losing Tiago. Rosa had already left with her daughter to tell her other kids that their dad wasn't coming home from his janitor shift ever again. We all walked to the elevator together, this group of strangers who were now bonded by the worst day of our lives. The parking lot was dark and cold as Harvey led me to his car, my own car still abandoned somewhere in the emergency room lot. The drive to his house took 20 minutes but felt like hours, neither of us talking, just the sound of the heater and late-night traffic. Paulina met us at the door with red eyes and pulled me into a hug, then showed me to their guest room where she'd put out towels and an old t-shirt of Harvey's for me to sleep in. I lay there in the dark replaying my last phone call, with Carly, over and over. How she'd sounded tired but happy, talking about some art project her kids were doing. I wished I'd said I love you one more time, instead of just saying I'd see her when I got home. The next morning, Harvey woke me up because reporters were already calling, the story all over the local news with headlines about the school district's negligence. The superintendent was on TV announcing his resignation, saying he took full responsibility, but it felt like such an empty gesture when 3 people were dead. The funerals were held together 4 days later at the community center because no church was big enough for the crowds. 3 caskets sat side by side at the front. Carly's covered with drawings from her students, Carlos's with flowers from the families whose classrooms he'd cleaned for years, and little Tiago's heartbreakingly small one, covered with toy cars and stuffed animals. The entire school district showed up, thousands of people filling the center and spilling out into the parking lot, all of them mourning lives that should never have been lost. Teachers spoke about Carly's dedication. Parents talked about how Carlos always had a smile for their kids, and Tiago's preschool teacher could barely get through talking about what a bright, happy boy he'd been. The service lasted 3 hours with people sharing memories and anger about how preventable this all was, how many times concerns had been raised and were ignored. 6 weeks later, I was back at the police station, where Detective Hoffman told me the investigation was complete. 3 district administrators were being charged with criminal negligence, facing up to 5 years in prison for ignoring safety warnings and redirecting maintenance funds. He showed me the evidence they'd collected, emails where administrators discussed the heating problems, but decided to wait until summer to fix them to save money. The district's lawyer had tried to argue it was just an accident, but the prosecutor said 3 people dying from known hazards that were ignored for months was criminal. Xavier called me that night after getting the same update, both of us feeling some small relief that there would be consequences, even though no amount of justice would bring them back. 2 weeks after the charges were filed, Xavier called me about meeting up to discuss something important, and we ended up at a coffee shop near the courthouse where we'd both been going for depositions. He pulled out a folder full of papers he'd been working on, ideas for a foundation that would push for better safety inspections in schools, something to make sure no other families went through what we did. We spent 3 hours going through his notes, adding ideas about mandatory carbon monoxide detectors and quarterly inspections, both of us needing to channel our grief into something that might save lives. The foundation paperwork took another month to file, but we named it after all 3 of them, the Carly Carlos and Tiago Safety Foundation, and by the time we announced it publicly, we already had dozens of other parents wanting to help. 3 months after everything happened, I finally went back to work. Just part-time at first because I still couldn't focus for more than a few hours without my mind drifting to that hospital room. My coworkers didn't know what to say when they saw me in the break room that first morning, some of them just nodding quietly, while others squeezed my shoulder as they walked past. My boss had moved my desk away from the window that faced toward Carly's school district, a small kindness I didn't ask for, but appreciated more than I could say. The district's lawyers contacted us 4 months after the tragedy with a settlement offer that made my stomach turn. Millions of dollars like that could somehow make up for 3 lives. Xavier and I met with our lawyers who said it was actually a good offer, that going to trial would take years and might not result in more money, though money was never what this was about. We signed the papers in a conference room that smelled like leather and old coffee, then immediately wrote a check for most of it to the foundation, because keeping that money felt wrong when it came from such loss. Rosa signed her settlement the same day, telling us she was using her portion to set up college funds for her kids, since Carlos had always worried about affording their education. 5 months in, Xavier called me late one evening and his voice sounded different. Lighter somehow, though still carrying that weight we both knew would never fully leave. He told me Danielle was pregnant, that they'd been trying because their house felt too empty without Tiago's voice filling it up, not trying to replace him because that was impossible, but needing to move forward somehow. We both cried on the phone for 20 minutes, him in his living room and me in mine, understanding that grief and hope could exist in the same space without canceling each other out. 6 months after losing Carly, I finally drove to her school to clean out her classroom, something I'd been putting off because I knew it would destroy me. The new principal met me at the door with a cart and helped me pack up her supplies. The reading corner she'd spent her own money decorating, the bins of art supplies she'd collected over the years, the little notes from students she'd saved in her desk drawer. I donated everything to new teachers just starting out, knowing Carly would want her materials to keep helping kids learn to read and write and dream. The safety regulations we'd been pushing for passed at the state level 8 months after the tragedy, requiring all schools to have carbon monoxide detectors in every classroom and monthly inspections of heating systems. The governor signed it into law at a ceremony where they called it the Carly, Carlos, and Tiago Act, and even though it was the legacy none of them would have were chosen, it meant their deaths would prevent others. Rosa called me 10 months later to tell me she was getting married to a man she'd met at grief counseling, someone who understood that Carlos would always be part of their family. At the wedding, she carried a photo of Carlos pinned inside her bouquet, and her kids each lit a candle for their dad during the ceremony, keeping him present in their new beginning. A year after that horrible day, I met the Matlocks and Rosa's family at the cemetery, where we'd buried them side by side in a section overlooking the hills. We stood there telling them about all the changes their deaths had brought, the safety laws, the foundation that had already helped inspect hundreds of schools, the lives that were saved because of what happened to them. Xavier's new baby was there in a carrier, a little girl they'd named Hope, and even Rosa's new husband came to pay respects to the man whose family he'd joined. We were all different people than we'd been a year ago, broken and rebuilt in new shapes, carrying our lost loves with us as we figured out how to keep living. The sun was setting as we left the cemetery, and I realized that moving forward didn't mean leaving them behind, that they were part of every step we took into whatever came next. Thanks for hanging out and wondering through all these questions with me today. Kinda wild journey, right? Anyway, I'll catch you next time. If you made it to the end, drop a comment. I love reading all your comments.